On a cold February morning in the year 2000, in a quiet Utah neighborhood where children rode their bikes down tree-lined streets and families waved to each other from front porches, a woman named Lori K. Soares Hacking vanished without a trace. She was 27 years old, 5 weeks pregnant, and according to her husband, she had gone for an early morning jog before dawn. By the time the sun had fully risen over the Wasatch Mountains, casting long shadows across Memory Grove Park, dozens of volunteers were already searching the trails, calling her name into the silence. Her running shoes were found. Her car was in the parking lot, but Lori herself had simply disappeared into the summer air, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Salt Lake City for years to come. How does a woman vanish in the heart of a city, during the hours when joggers and early risers fill the paths, without a single witness, without a sound, without a struggle that anyone could see? The story that followed would grip the nation, unraveling slowly like a thread pulled from a carefully woven tapestry, revealing not just the mystery of what happened that morning, but the deeper, more disturbing truth about the man who claimed to love her most. This is the story of Lori Hacking, and the cold case that eventually shattered the illusion of a perfect marriage, exposing the lies that can live inside a home, whispered between walls, hidden behind smiles in family photographs. This is the story of how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually fights its way to the surface. Salt Lake City in the summer of 2000 sat nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, a place where the air smelled of sagebrush and pine, where the sky stretched wide and impossibly blue. The city itself was a mixture of old pioneer history and modern suburban sprawl, with temple spires rising above downtown and neighborhoods spreading out in neat grids toward the foothills. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where families attended church together on Sundays, where the community held tight to values of trust and togetherness. In the Federal Heights neighborhood, just east of the University of Utah campus, the streets were lined with modest homes, well-kept lawns, and the sound of sprinklers clicking in the evening heat. Lori K. Soares had grown up in Orem, about 45 miles south, in a close-knit family that valued education and faith. She was described by everyone who knew her as vivacious, intelligent, deeply caring. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders, a bright smile that appeared in every photograph, and a laugh that friends said could fill a room. She worked as a stockbroker at Wells Fargo, a job she took seriously, arriving early and staying late, building relationships with clients who trusted her judgment. She was meticulous, organized, the kind of person who kept lists and planned ahead, who remembered birthdays and never missed an appointment. Those who worked with her said she was professional, kind, always willing to help a colleague struggling with a difficult account. She had met Mark Douglas Hacking when they were both students at the University of Utah. He was studying psychology, or so everyone believed, working toward a medical degree that would take him to North Carolina for medical school in the fall. They married in 1999, just a year before her disappearance, in a ceremony surrounded by family and friends, with photographs showing them smiling on the temple steps, her white dress bright in the afternoon sun. They moved into a small apartment in the Federal Heights area, furnished modestly, living the life of young marrieds saving for the future. Mark worked nights at a psychiatric hospital, coming home in the early morning hours, sleeping during the day while Lori was at work. Neighbors rarely saw them together, but when they did, the couple seemed happy, normal, unremarkable in every way. The morning of July 19, 2000, began like any other summer Monday in Salt Lake City. The sun rose at 6:17, casting golden light across the valley. The temperature was already climbing toward what would be a hot day, the kind where the asphalt shimmered and the mountains seemed to waver in the distance. Lori had told Mark the night before that she planned to go jogging early, before the heat became unbearable, before she had to be at work. She had been jogging regularly, trying to stay healthy during the early weeks of her pregnancy, a pregnancy they had only recently discovered and shared with close family members. The baby was due in February, and Lori had already begun talking about names, about nursery colors, about the future they were building together. Mark later told investigators that he woke around 6:30 that morning to find Lori already gone. He said he assumed she had left for her jog as planned. He said he went back to sleep. He said that when he woke again around 10:30, he realized she had not returned. He said he called her work and learned she had not arrived. He said he grew concerned. He said he drove to Memory Grove Park, the place where she often jogged, and found her car in the parking lot. He said he saw her running shoes on the ground nearby. He said he immediately called the police. These were the things he said, the story he told, the narrative that would be repeated in news conferences and newspaper articles in the hours and days that followed. But even from the beginning, there were details that did not fit together cleanly, small inconsistencies that stuck in the minds of the investigators who arrived at Memory Grove Park that morning. The running shoes, for instance, were placed neatly side by side, not kicked off or scattered as they might be if someone had been taken by force. The car was locked. Lori's purse was still inside, her wallet intact. There were no signs of struggle on the trail, no disturbed earth, no broken branches, no indication that anything violent had occurred in that peaceful grove of trees where City Creek ran cold and clear over smooth stones. By noon, the park was filled with police officers, search and rescue teams, volunteers from the neighborhood who had heard the news and come to help. They walked the trails in long lines, calling Lori's name, checking behind boulders and in the dense brush along the creek. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors thumping against the summer air. Bloodhounds were brought in, sniffing the shoes, the car, trying to pick up a scent that might lead them to the missing woman. The search expanded outward, covering miles of terrain, moving from the park into the surrounding neighborhoods, checking dumpsters and abandoned buildings, knocking on doors to ask if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning. Mark Hacking stood among the searchers, his face drawn and pale, answering questions from investigators with what seemed like genuine confusion and fear. He was 28 years old, tall and slim, with sandy brown hair and the kind of forgettable face that blended into crowds. He wore casual clothes, shorts and a t-shirt, and he kept his hands in his pockets as he talked. He told the same story repeatedly, with only minor variations, about waking to find Lori gone, about finding her car and shoes, about the growing panic that led him to call the police. He said she had no enemies, no one who would want to hurt her. He said their marriage was strong. He said they were excited about the baby. He said he could not imagine where she might be or what might have happened to her. The media descended on Salt Lake City within hours, satellite trucks lining the streets near Memory Grove Park, reporters doing live shots with the mountains in the background, anchors repeating the same facts over and over. 27 years old, 5 weeks pregnant, vanished during a morning jog. The story had all the elements that captured national attention. A young woman, an expectant mother, a mysterious disappearance in broad daylight, a devoted husband pleading for her safe return. Lori's photograph appeared on television screens across the country, her smile frozen in time, her eyes looking out at viewers who wondered what had happened to her, who hoped she would be found safe. But as the first day stretched into evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the temperature finally dropped, the search teams began to pull back, exhausted and empty-handed. No trace of Lori had been found. No witnesses had come forward. The trails of Memory Grove Park had yielded nothing but questions. Investigators gathered in the parking lot, comparing notes, their faces grim in the fading light. Something about this case felt wrong, though none of them could articulate exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the neatness of the scene, the lack of any evidence of violence or flight. Perhaps it was the way Mark Hacking's story remained so consistent, so unwavering, as if it had been rehearsed. Perhaps it was simply the instinct that comes from years of working cases like this, the sense that the truth was hiding somewhere just out of sight, waiting to be uncovered. The search continued through the week, growing larger each day as more volunteers arrived from across the state. The Soares family came from Orem, Lori's parents and siblings joining the effort, their faces tight with worry and exhaustion. They held a press conference on the third day, standing in front of cameras with Mark beside them, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Lori's mother spoke through tears, describing her daughter's kindness, her excitement about becoming a mother, the plans they had made together for the baby's arrival. Mark stood silent, his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him. He did not speak. When reporters called his name, asking for a statement, he simply shook his head and walked away, leaving Lori's family to face the cameras alone. Those who knew him said Mark seemed oddly distant during those first days, as if he were watching the search unfold from a great distance rather than living through it himself. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about his demeanor, about the way he answered questions without emotion, about the strange calm that seemed to settle over him even as chaos swirled around. One investigator noted in his report that Mark's eyes remained dry during the press conference, even as Lori's mother wept openly. Another wrote that Mark seemed more concerned with the logistics of the search than with his missing wife, asking about grid patterns and search areas rather than simply asking if she had been found. Clears throat. For those who have ever been part of a search for a missing person, you know the particular kind of exhaustion that sets in after days of walking the same ground, calling the same name, hopping for a miracle that does not come. The volunteers who searched for Lori experienced this in waves, the initial adrenaline giving way to grim determination, then to a kind of desperate hope that felt increasingly futile as time passed. They searched the park, the neighborhoods, the foothills. They waded into City Creek, checking beneath bridges and in culverts. They climbed rocky slopes and pushed through dense underbrush. They found nothing. By the end of the first week, the official search began to wind down. The helicopters stopped circling. The search and rescue teams were called to other emergencies. The volunteers drifted away, returning to their jobs and their families, leaving behind only the core investigators who now began to shift their focus from rescue to investigation. This was when the questions started in earnest, when the timeline began to be picked apart minute by minute, when the inconsistencies that had been small whispers became louder, more insistent. Investigators pulled Mark Hacking's phone records and found calls that did not match his story. They checked his work schedule and discovered discrepancies. They interviewed neighbors who said they had not seen Lori jogging that morning, though several were awake and outside during the hours Mark claimed she had left. They examined the mileage on both cars and found numbers that did not align with the routes Mark said he had driven. They went through the couple's apartment with careful attention, photographing every room, cataloging every detail, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. What they found was strange in its absence. There was no jogging outfit missing from Lori's closet, no exercise clothes in the laundry basket, no indication that she had dressed for a run that morning. Her work clothes were still hanging in the closet, her briefcase packed for the day ahead. The bed appeared to have been slept in on both sides, the covers rumpled, the pillows bearing the indentations of two heads. But something felt staged about it, as if the scene had been arranged rather than simply lived in. One detective noted that the bedroom smelled of cleaning products, an unusual detail for a Monday morning in July. Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic as the investigation continued. On the fourth day, he checked himself into a psychiatric facility, claiming he was having thoughts of harming himself, unable to cope with Lori's disappearance. The timing struck investigators as odd, coming just as they were preparing to interview him more intensively. From the hospital, Mark released a statement through an attorney, expressing his continued hope that Lori would be found and his cooperation with the investigation. But the hospitalization effectively put him out of reach of questioning, creating a barrier between him and the detectives who were growing more suspicious by the hour. It was during this time that investigators began digging deeper into Mark Hacking's background, and what they found shook the foundation of everything they thought they knew about the case. Mark had not been accepted to medical school in North Carolina. In fact, Mark had never graduated from the University of Utah. He had dropped out years earlier, had been lying about his enrollment, had been leaving the apartment each day as if going to class when in reality he was doing nothing, going nowhere, living an elaborate fiction. The acceptance letter he had shown Lori, the plans they had made to move across the country, the celebration with family over his achievement, all of it had been based on lies. Mark Hacking was not a soon-to-be doctor. He was a college dropout working night shifts at a psychiatric hospital, pretending to be someone he was not, living a double life that his wife had only recently discovered. This revelation changed everything. Investigators learned that Lori had found out the truth just days before her disappearance. She had called the medical school in North Carolina to ask about housing options and been told that no one by the name of Mark Hacking had been accepted. She had confronted him. According to family members, she had been devastated, humiliated, struggling to understand how the man she married could have deceived her so completely, for so long. The question now was not just where Lori had gone, but whether she had gone voluntarily at all. The case went cold in the official sense by late summer, though investigators never stopped working it, never stopped believing that Mark Hacking knew more than he was saying. The searches ended. The media moved on to other stories. The volunteers returned to their normal lives, but Lori's family remained, caught in a terrible limbo, not knowing whether to grieve or to hope, unable to move forward without answers. They held vigils. They posted flyers. They created a website where people could share tips or prayers. They kept Lori's memory alive in the only way they knew how, by refusing to let her be forgotten, by insisting that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to their daughter, their sister, their friend. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the ground shift beneath your feet when a truth you believe turns out to be a lie, you can perhaps imagine what Lori experienced in those final days before she vanished. The discovery of Mark's deception would have shattered her world, called into question every memory, every plan, every moment they had shared. Who was the man she had married? What else had he lied about? Could she trust anything he said, anything he did, any promise he made? These questions must have echoed in her mind as she tried to decide what to do, how to move forward, whether to stay or leave or demand the truth. Months passed. The leaves changed color in the mountains, gold and red against the evergreens. Snow fell on the peaks. The city moved through autumn into winter, and still there was no sign of Lori Hacking, no break in the case, no new leads. Mark remained in the psychiatric facility through August, then was released and moved in with his parents in the Holiday area south of Salt Lake City. He did not return to work. He did not speak to the media. He hired an attorney and stopped cooperating with investigators, exercising his right to remain silent in the face of their increasingly direct questions. The Soares family struggled through the holidays without Lori, setting a place for her at Thanksgiving dinner, hanging her stocking at Christmas, marking her birthday in November with a gathering at Memory Grove Park where they released balloons and played her favorite music. The absence was a physical presence in their lives, a weight that settled over every celebration, every family gathering, every moment when they should have been complete but were not. They spoke to reporters occasionally, keeping the story alive, reminding people that Laurie was still missing, that someone out there might know something, might have seen something, might finally be willing to come forward with the truth. Winter turned to spring. The snow melted in the mountains. The creeks ran high with runoff. Memory Grove Park filled with joggers and families once again, life continuing in the place where Laurie had last been seen, or at least where her car and shoes had been found. The case file remained open on detectives' desks, but with no new evidence, no witnesses, no body, there was little they could do except wait and hope that something would break, that someone's conscience would finally outweigh their fear or loyalty or whatever had kept them silent. It was in late July, more than a year after Laurie's disappearance, that the first crack appeared in Mark Hacking's carefully constructed wall of silence. He had been living with his parents, isolated from former friends, estranged from Laurie's family, existing in a kind of suspended animation where the past could not be confronted and the future could not be imagined. But the weight of what he knew, what he had done, proved too heavy to carry alone forever. On July 24, 2001, Mark's brother received a phone call that would finally begin to answer the questions that had haunted Salt Lake City for 13 months. Mark had confessed, not to his brother directly, but to others, and the information had made its way through whispered conversations and careful deliberations, until it reached someone who felt compelled to tell the truth. The details were horrifying in their simplicity. Mark admitted that Laurie had never gone jogging that morning. He admitted that he had argued with her about his lies, about their future, about the life they had built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath them. He admitted that in the early morning hours of July 19, 2000, as Laurie slept beside him in their bed, he had taken her life, had ended her future and the future of their unborn child with an act of violence so sudden and final that she likely never knew what was happening. He admitted that he had placed her body in a dumpster behind a furniture store, had disposed of the woman he claimed to love as if she were garbage, as if 13 months of marriage and a lifetime of her hopes and dreams could be erased with a single decision. He admitted that he had then created the jogging story, had driven to Memory Grove Park, had placed her shoes carefully on the ground and locked her car, had built an entire false narrative designed to send investigators looking in the wrong direction, while her body was transported to a landfill, buried beneath tons of waste, lost forever in the massive expanse of the Salt Lake Valley landfill. The confession came to investigators through Mark's attorney, who negotiated the terms carefully, seeking to avoid the death penalty in exchange for leading police to the location where Laurie's remains might be found. On August 1, 2001, Mark Hacking was arrested and charged with first-degree homicide. The news broke across the city like a thunderclap, confirming what many had suspected but no one wanted to believe. The search that had consumed Salt Lake City the previous summer had been a waste, a wild goose chase orchestrated by the very person who should have been helping, who should have been desperate to find his wife, who instead had watched volunteers comb the mountains and canyons knowing full well that Laurie was nowhere near Memory Grove Park, knowing that she would never be found, knowing that he had put her somewhere no one would think to look. The landfill search began immediately, a massive undertaking that would consume weeks of labor and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Workers in hazmat suits sifted through tons of garbage, picking through refuse that had been accumulating since July 2000, looking for any trace of Laurie Hacking's remains. The work was hot, grueling, heartbreaking. The smell was overwhelming. The task seemed impossible. But investigators were determined to bring Lori home, to give her family the closure they deserved, to recover even the smallest piece of evidence that might help them understand what had happened in those final moments of her life. On October 1, 2001, nearly 15 months after Lori's disappearance, searchers found what they had been looking for. The remains were fragmentary, damaged by time and the conditions of the landfill, but forensic analysis confirmed they were Lori's. The medical examiner determined that she had been deceased since July 2000, consistent with Mark's confession. The cause was determined based on Mark's admission and the circumstances of her disappearance. She had been 5 weeks pregnant. She had been 27 years old. She had been planning a future that would never arrive, carrying a child who would never be born, trusting a man who had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible. The Soares family held a funeral service in October, finally able to lay Lori to rest, to have a place to visit and grieve, to begin the impossible process of accepting that she was truly gone. Hundreds attended, filling the church to capacity, spilling out onto the lawn outside. They spoke of Lori's kindness, her intelligence, her excitement about becoming a mother. They spoke of the injustice of her passing, the senselessness of it, the way a life full of promise had been cut short by someone who had claimed to love her. They did not speak Mark's name. He had become, in their eyes and in the eyes of the community, not a person but an absence, a void where a husband should have been, a betrayal so complete that even his name seemed unworthy of being spoken aloud. Mark Hacking's trial proceeded through the court system over the following years, delayed by psychological evaluations, plea negotiations, and the complex nature of the evidence. In April 2004, nearly 4 years after Lori's disappearance, Mark pleaded guilty to first-degree homicide in a courtroom filled with Lori's family and friends. He stood before the judge and admitted what he had done, speaking in a flat, emotionless voice that revealed nothing of remorse or understanding. He said, "I accept full responsibility for taking the life of my wife, Lori K. Hacking, and my unborn child." These were the words the family had waited years to hear, though they brought no comfort, no relief, no sense that justice had truly been served. The judge sentenced Mark Hacking to 6 years to life in prison, the maximum sentence available under Utah law at the time. He would be eligible for parole after 6 years, though the parole board could choose to keep him incarcerated indefinitely. The sentence felt inadequate to those who had loved Lori, who believed that no amount of time could balance the scales, could restore what had been taken, could give back the life and the future that had been stolen in a moment of rage or calculation or whatever dark impulse had driven Mark to choose violence over honesty, destruction over divorce, permanent silence over temporary shame. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive, with reporters nodding the packed courtroom, the tears of Lori's family, the stoic expression on Mark's face as he was led away in handcuffs. Some outlets revisited the timeline of the case, the frantic search, the discovery of Mark's lies, the eventual confession. Others focused on the psychological aspects, interviewing experts about sociopathic behavior, about people who construct elaborate false realities, about the warning signs that might help others identify deception in their own relationships. The case became a touchstone for discussions about trust and betrayal, about the dangers of keeping secrets, about the importance of being honest even when the truth is difficult or shameful. Those who believed in Mark's innocence, though few, argued that he had been pressured into a false confession, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the discovery of remains in the landfill proved nothing definitive. But these voices were drowned out by the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, by his own admission, by the timeline and the lies and the impossibility of any other explanation making sense. The community that had searched for Laurie, that had hoped she might be found alive, that had believed in the possibility of a happy ending, now had to reconcile themselves to the terrible truth that she had been gone from the moment Mark reported her missing, that every hour spent searching Memory Grove Park had been wasted, that the person who knew the truth had been standing among them all along, watching their futile efforts with a face arranged in an expression of concern and grief. For those who have noticed the way a lie can spread like a stain, touching everything it comes near, you will understand how Mark Hacking's deception infected not just his marriage but the entire community. The volunteers who searched for Laurie had to live with the knowledge that they had been manipulated, used as props in Mark's performance of innocence. The investigators who had suspected him from the beginning had to live with the frustration of knowing they were right but being unable to prove it for months. Laurie's family had to live with the knowledge that they had stood beside Mark at press conferences, had included him in their prayers and vigils, had treated him as a grieving husband when he was actually the architect of their grief. The case raised questions about other disappearances, about other husbands who reported their wives missing, about the statistics that show intimate partners are so often the perpetrators of violence against women. It sparked conversations about the red flags that had been present in Mark and Laurie's relationship, the lies that should have been warnings, the isolation that Mark had created around himself, the way he had controlled information and managed perceptions. Friends admitted they had seen signs but had dismissed them, had given Mark the benefit of the doubt, had not wanted to believe that someone they knew could be capable of such an act. Memory Grove Park remains a popular place for joggers and families, though there is now a small memorial near the parking lot where Laurie's car was found, a plaque with her name and dates, a reminder of the young woman who did not die there but whose disappearance began there in the story Mark told. People stop sometimes to read it, to leave flowers, to remember a life that ended too soon and under circumstances too terrible to fully comprehend. The grove is peaceful, the creek still runs clear, the trees still provide shade on hot summer days. Life continues there as it must, even in places touched by tragedy. Mark Hacking remains incarcerated in the Utah State Prison, having been denied parole at every hearing since becoming eligible. The parole board has cited the nature of his offense, his lack of remorse, and the danger he would pose to the community if released. He will be eligible for another parole hearing in the coming years, though few expect the outcome to be different. Laurie's family attends each hearing, submitting victim impact statements, reminding the board of what was taken from them, ensuring that their daughter's voice is heard even though she cannot speak for herself. The Soares family has worked to keep Laurie's memory alive through a foundation established in her name, providing scholarships to young women pursuing careers in finance and business, supporting organizations that work to prevent domestic violence, speaking at events about the importance of recognizing warning signs and seeking help. They have turned their grief into action, their loss into a legacy, ensuring that Laurie's life meant something beyond the terrible way it ended. They speak of her not as a victim but as a person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who loved deeply and worked hard and looked forward to a future she never got to see. The case of Laurie Hacking serves as a reminder that the people we think we know best can sometimes be strangers, that the life we see on the surface can hide depths of deception beneath, that trust is both necessary and dangerous, that love does not always protect us from harm. It reminds us that justice, when it finally comes, can feel both triumphant and hollow, that knowing the truth does not erase the pain of loss, that closure is not the same as peace. It reminds us that every missing person is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone whose absence leaves a hole that can never be filled, whose life mattered in ways that extend far beyond the circumstances of their passing. The swing hung still in the playground near Lori's childhood home in Orem. The toy truck lay on its side in the storage unit where her parents had packed away the belongings from her apartment, unable to sort through them, unable to let them go. The photographs remained in albums, showing a young woman smiling in cap and gown, in wedding dress, in candid moments when she did not know the camera was there. These are the remnants of a life interrupted, the evidence of a future stolen, the proof that Lori K. Soares' hacking existed, mattered, deserved better than what she received. Clear's throat, the investigation into Lori's disappearance and the eventual conviction of Mark Hacking closed a chapter in Salt Lake City's history, but the story does not really end there. It continues in the lives of everyone who knew her, everyone who searched for her, everyone who learned her name through the news coverage and felt the weight of her loss. It continues in the policies and procedures that law enforcement agencies have refined in response to cases like hers, in the training that teaches investigators to look closely at the people closest to the victim, in the awareness campaigns that educate the public about domestic violence and the dangers that can exist behind closed doors. The truth about what happened to Lori Hacking took more than a year to emerge fully, but once it did, it reshaped everything that had come before. The frantic search became a tragic waste of resources. The husband's grief revealed itself as performance. The hope for a happy ending transformed into the certainty of a terrible crime. But the search for truth, no matter how painful, is always worthwhile, because truth is what we owe to victims, what we owe to their families, what we owe to ourselves as a society that claims to value justice and accountability. This case mattered then, in the summer of 2000, when Salt Lake City came together to search for a missing woman. It matters now, as we continue to grapple with questions about how to protect people from those who claim to love them, how to recognize deception before it turns deadly, how to support survivors and remember victims with dignity and respect. It will matter in the future, as long as people continue to trust and love and build lives together, as long as there is the possibility of betrayal, as long as there are families waiting for answers about loved ones who have disappeared. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard. Someone somewhere may be living with a secret that weighs too heavy to carry alone. Someone somewhere may need to know that the truth, no matter how long it takes, no matter how deeply it has been buried, can still come to light. Lori Hacking's story is a testament to that truth, and to the persistence of those who refuse to let victims be forgotten, who refuse to let justice be delayed indefinitely, who insist that every life has value and every person deserves to be remembered for who they were, not just for how they died.